Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Scottish monarchs. In an earlier video we looked at the family tree of English monarchs and then also the British monarchs after England and Scotland united, and those are shown here in the red. But in that video I did not cover the Scottish monarchs before the union of the two crowns, shown here in dark blue. So that's what I'm going to do today. And as usual I'll be using my European royal family tree chart, which can be purchased as a poster from my website usefulcharts.com. Now, the first king of Scotland is generally considered to be Kenneth McAlpin, and he lived in the same century as Alfred the Great. And I should point out that I'll be using the anglicized pronunciations throughout rather than the Gaelic. So just keep in mind that these individuals would have actually pronounced their names quite differently. Now, although Kenneth McAlpin is generally considered the first king of Scotland, he wasn't really the king of Scotland at all. And that's because Scotland, as we know it, didn't actually exist back then. So let's quickly look at a map to explain. This map was made by Carl Craig. You can see that Scotland was originally inhabited by several different groups of people. The Scots, who were Celtic and spoke Gaelic, were mostly confined to this orange area here, the kingdom of Dalriada. But there was also a different branch of Celtic people who spoke a Brittonic language similar to Welsh, and they were located here in the green. And there was a third Celtic group, the Picts, and there's less certainty over how exactly they were related to the other two Celtic groups, but they lived here in this blue area. And finally, there were the recent arrivals, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic peoples who eventually became the English, and they lived in this yellow area here. So we know that Kenneth McAlpin was a Scot and that he became king of the Picts by conquest. And in the centuries that followed, the Scots and the Picts merged slowly and also extended their territory south until they became what we know now as Scotland. But this process did not happen overnight. So back to the family tree chart. I haven't shown every descendant of Kenneth McAlpin that became king because there were many of them, and the throne often passed back and forth between various branches of the family. So our real story is going to begin with Malcolm II, who reigned about 1,000 years ago and who was the final king of the original House of Alpin. By this time, Scotland had established itself as a unified nation north of England. But at the time of his death, Malcolm did not have any sons to inherit the throne, so the crown passed to a grandson who became Duncan I. And this established a new royal house, the House of Dunkeld. And this King Duncan is also a character in the famous Shakespeare play Macbeth. And Macbeth was possibly another grandson of Malcolm II through a different daughter, but the exact parentage is somewhat unclear. Now in the play, Macbeth murders Duncan in his sleep, frames the guards, and becomes king. He and his wife, Lady Macbeth, then descend into madness and commit a bunch more murders. In reality, however, Duncan died in battle while attacking Macbeth's territory, after which Macbeth became king and reigns quite peacefully for 17 years. In the play, Macbeth is killed by a character called Macduff, and Malcolm III, son of Duncan I, instantly becomes king. In reality, Macbeth died in battle and was actually succeeded by his son for a few months before the throne then goes to Malcolm III. Now, Malcolm III is important because he provides an early link between the royal houses of England and Scotland. This is because he married a member of the English House of Wessex, a woman who is now known as St. Margaret of Scotland. And their daughter went on to marry King Henry I of England, who belonged to the House of Norman. And this marriage meant that all future monarchs of England and later Great Britain could trace their lineage not only to William the Conqueror of Normandy, but also to the original House of Wessex and to the House of Dunkeld in Scotland. But enough about England. Let's go back to Scotland. Now, there's a small mistake on the chart. Duncan II, who fought with his uncle Donald III over the throne after the death of Malcolm III, was actually the son of Malcolm III and his first wife, not St. Margaret. But that doesn't matter because Duncan II didn't reign long, and the throne actually passed to his younger brothers. First Edgar, then Alexander I, and then finally David I. And David I was followed by two of his grandsons, Malcolm IV, and then William the Lion. And it's during the reign of William the Lion that Scotland started to use this coat of arms, which we now are quite familiar with today, the red lion on the yellow background. And this particular symbol can still be seen as part of the coat of arms of Great Britain today. William was followed by his son Alexander II, who married Joan of England, daughter of King John of England. Now there's another small mistake here because although he was married to Joan of England, King Alexander III was actually the son of Alexander II and his second wife. Alexander III also married an English princess, and they had a son also named Alexander that would have become Alexander IV, but he died at age 19. His sister Margaret, who had married the King of Norway, also died, leaving their 3-year-old daughter, also named Margaret, as the only possible heir to Alexander III. So this individual here becomes queen at age 3. Now, at the time, Edward I of England, who was King of England, put forward a plan to have Margaret marry his son Edward, who would become Edward II. And had this happened, England and Scotland would perhaps have been united much earlier. But this did never happen because Margaret died at age 7. And this threw Scotland into a succession crisis. Now, after the death of Margaret, there were two individuals who had the best claim to the throne, and they were both descendants of this individual here, who was a brother of King William the Lion. There was Robert the Bruce, and the other, who's not shown on this chart, was John Balliol, who was also a descendant of this individual here through a different daughter. And Edward I of England helped put John Balliol on the throne, but then proceeded to use him as a puppet to control Scotland's affairs. And of course, the Scottish people didn't like this, and by 1295 they had had enough. A group of 12 leading men took control, formed an alliance with France, and then this led King Edward I of England to invade Scotland. And John Balliol eventually abdicated. The wars of Scottish independence began. And if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, it's based on this particular time period and features a contemporary of Robert the Bruce known as William Wallace, one of the Scottish leaders. Eventually, Robert the Bruce declares himself king in 1306, and over the next decade he takes back most of Scotland from the English. However, the wars between England and Scotland would continue about halfway through the reign of his son, King David II. King David II married the sister of King Edward III. That was Joan of England. He also married a second time but did not produce any heirs, and therefore the throne, after his death, passed to a grandson of Robert the Bruce, and he belonged to the House of Stuart, and he became King Robert II. And King Robert II was then followed by Robert III and then James I. And James I was married to a descendant of the royal line. You can see that connection here. Their son James II then becomes king, was followed by James III, who married into the Danish royal family. And then we get James IV, who married the sister of King Henry VIII of England. And this is extremely important because when King Henry VIII's line dies out, closest heir to the English throne was actually the King of Scotland because of this marriage here. Margaret and James had a son who became James V, and then James V had a daughter who became Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, a lot of people get her confused with Queen Mary I of England, who is also known as Bloody Mary. And these are actually two different people. Bloody Mary was the half-sister of Queen Elizabeth I of England and ruled before her, whereas Mary, Queen of Scots, was alive at the same time as Queen Mary I of England and the first part of Elizabeth I's reign, but was reigning in Scotland. And Elizabeth famously had Mary beheaded because it was suspected that Mary was involved in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth and take the English throne. In the end, Elizabeth I of England, who never married, left the throne of England to Mary's son, who had become James VI of Scotland, but was now also James I of England. And this is known as the Union of the Crowns. And from this point forward, Scotland and England always share the same monarch. And this union was made permanent during the reign of Queen Anne, when the kingdoms of Scotland and England cease to exist, and then they become the Kingdom of Great Britain instead. Now, as mentioned at the beginning, I did a separate video starting with the English monarchy and then continuing through these kings and queens of Great Britain. So if you want to see how that line continued after James I and VI, you can check out that video. But that covers the monarchs of Scotland and their family tree. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to get a poster of this chart, it's available on my website, usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.